Andréia, espera que a gente vai começar agora, depois eu te ligo. Gente, nós teremos que começar.
Depois.
Ele dá pra de cabo para carregar o laptop dele.
Vou tentar fazer.
Bom dia, bom dia. Bom dia a todos. Hello, how are you all? I think we should start. We're a little bit late. So this will be the first panel. And I'm going to be chairing it. Monica Hertz from the Instituto Latino-Americano para o Multilateralismo. We have here with us José Vicente, now. Mohin Santos from FASI. Thank you for being here. And Jan Wouters from Louvain. Unfortunately, Benedict Ho from the University of Oslo could not be here for personal reasons. We will start with an initial 10-minute presentation by all panelists, and we will be asking how would you define the current global context and the main opportunities and challenges for multilateral cooperation in general, and for multilateral cooperation about the environment and climate change in particular. So let me just start this, just introduce this discussion. I think we had an amazing presentation by Eduardo Viola that puts us in the mood, or not such a good mood, for the state of multilateralism. I would like to perhaps add some general ideas. I think that our multilateral system, our post-95, post-45 multilateral system was very much based on two concepts. On the concept of interdependence and growing interdependence that was perceived even then, but of course, as time went on, it became more and more relevant. Of course, climate issues put this very much at the center of our debate. And on the other hand, a concept of humanity that involves an idea of somehow a collective community. Some call it a human community or national community. But I think a general idea that there is a more universal concept of humanity that lives with the more national and particularistic concept of the nation, the national community, and these two pillars of the multilateral system seem to be in a profound crisis. It is very clear when we look at the platform for international relations and foreign policy of far-right movements and parties, but not only. And what we see is a growing nationalist aggressive posture by key actors that make it very difficult to sustain a multilateral system based on the idea that norms can be built internationally, that negotiations can take place internationally, that a certain level of respect and reciprocity take place internationally. Moreover, we are living in a world where the concept of humanity, and in particular the idea that humans have common rights, human rights, humanitarian rights, other rights, is also in crisis. I think that the whole agenda, multilateral agenda that involved throughout the years growing inclusion, growing consciousness regarding interdependence and the need to produce norms and negotiations to deal with this independence, the idea that public policy cannot be only solely national, that this is fundamentally wrong, but also inefficient. And these ideas that I, for instance, grew up with are all in crisis in different levels and all affect the manner in which we deal with the environmental questions and the climate issues in particular. As Eduardo said, we cannot deal with the climate issue in isolation. It is part of a broader process of profound crisis that we are going through now. And of course, that doesn't mean that we can't think in terms of possible paths ahead.
Gracias. Pasa mi presentación en español. En realidad, quiero dar un poco continuidad a lo que ha señalado Mónica. Yo obviamente un experto en temas ambientales y me asusta un poco tratar una temática teniendo además acá a personas como Mónica que se han trabajado sobre este tema. Pero yo más bien prefiero concentrarme un poco profundizar lo que estaba señalando Mónica del contexto en el cual, digamos, el Pacto Verde de la Unión Europea está desarrollado después de su anuncio en el año 2019. Un poco la idea es analizar si el contexto que estamos viviendo, tanto a nivel global, cambios que están produciendo a nivel global, como los cambios que se están produciendo a nivel doméstico en actores claves, Europa, Estados Unidos, crean condiciones favorables para que el Pacto Verde efectivamente se profundice y se aplique, digamos, con las metas originalmente planteadas, o si por el contrario las condiciones han cambiado mucho en un lapso relativamente breve y el escenario tanto global como europeo, estadounidense, más bien que las condiciones adversas para la profundización de una normativa global más allá del Pacto Verde sobre medio ambiente, cambio climático, etc. Y yo creo que hay otros puntos que para mí son críticos, y insisto, luego de haber escuchado la presentación de EULAS, puedo poner ciertos repetirlo, pero poder repetir cosas, pero creo que es importante profundizar en ello. Un elemento del contexto global del mundial es la crisis de la globalización. La globalización es un proceso la naturaleza de esa crisis tiene, digamos, diferentes lecturas, pero hay una crítica y un cuestionamiento. Un segundo punto que caracteriza el orden internacional actual es, no diría que el retorno, porque quizás nunca desapareció, pero sí de nuevo la fortaleza de la lógica geopolítica en la política mundial. La geopolítica reaparece con fuerza en la región. Tiene un lugar que aparentemente en el mundo globalizado, de fin de la historia de los años 90, donde aparentemente lo que buscábamos eran las transacciones comerciales, las inversiones, que señalaba Mónica, la interdependencia. Eso hoy en día no está desaparecido, pero compite con una dinámica geopolítica que no va a mirar, vamos a analizar. Yo creo que un tercer elemento que no podemos dejar de analizar y de mencionar es la utilización de la política comercial como instrumento de poder. Y eso tiene efectos, evidentemente, en el régimen multilateral, el multilateralismo general, porque uno de los pilares de ese sistema multilateral, así como en el ámbito de la seguridad y la paz, eran las Naciones Unidas, en el ámbito, digamos, económico, eran los Estados Unidos de Comercio y su papel en la promoción y la tendencia. Y un cuarto factor que creo que es inescapable y que es más a nivel doméstico de los distintos países es el surgimiento de una extrema derecha negacionista del problema ambiental, del problema climático, que es originalmente se percibía como un proceso vinculado al norte desarrollado, extrema derecha en Europa, extrema derecha obviamente en Estados Unidos con la emergencia del trumpismo, pero yo veo que en América Latina también ha adquirido fuerza y la narrativa, el discurso de los gobiernos, por ejemplo, de Milei en la Argentina, es negación. Yo creo que esos cuatro factores no crean realmente condiciones favorables para una consolidación de un régimen climático de protección del medio ambiente global. O sea, creo que lo que se ha conseguido en cosas, ya eso se explicó en detalle en la presentación, se han hecho avances, pero es posible profundizar más en medio de este contexto global. Y no lo sé. Primero, estamos en un cuestionamiento de la globalización. Primero, aquella idea del mundo sin fronteras, de la globalización de las finanzas, la integración de los mercados financieros mundiales, el libre comercio, y se firmaba en los años 90, no sé cuántos, acuerdos de libre comercio. El economista indoamericano David Basbati habló de un spaghetti bowl, tratados de libre comercio, con la cantidad de acuerdos que se firmaron. Ese mundo culturalmente homogéneo, bajo las ideas del liberalismo, del fin de la historia del capitalismo, es un mundo está cuestionado. Es un mundo está cuestionado. Y hay varios factores. Yo creo que la pandemia, siempre se usa la pandemia como disruptor, por ejemplo, de las cadenas de valor, y eso es cierto. Pero creo que mucho antes de la pandemia ya se estaban dando procesos que, digamos, afectaban, debilitaban esas lógicas de globalización. La crisis financiera. La crisis financiera, tanto la crisis financiera de 2008 como la crisis del euro en Europa y las reiteradas crisis en países latinoamericanos. Evidenciaba una desconfianza en el funcionamiento del sistema financiero. Hay datos específicos que demuestran que por lo menos a partir del año 2018, es cierto, ahí está el periodo de pandemia que puede hacer que el dato sea al menos debatible, pero a partir de 2018 hay un decrecimiento del comercio. El comercio mundial en términos globales ha decrecido y ese es un hecho sin duda importante y significativo porque ese era uno de los factores de los elementos centrales. Y además, en las cadenas de valor, la integración productiva era como la casi quinta esencia de la globalización, ¿no? Una cadena productiva, gran parte del crecimiento de China como agente importante en la economía mundial se debió a su participación en las cadenas de valor que están rompiéndose después de la pandemia. Hay lógicas de poder detrás de esa estructura de las cadenas de valor y se está volviendo a prácticas que hacen que la producción se articule más bien a nivel nacional, no tanto a nivel global. Y eso tiene que ver con el ascenso de China y el tratar de romper ese poder de China en muchas cadenas. Entonces se habla del nearshoring, se habla del onshoring, que es volver a la producción a nivel doméstico, se habla del friendshoring, hacer, ¿cómo se llama? Cadenas de valor con amigos, con países aliados ideológicamente, y eso rompe con la lógica. Para la narrativa de la globalización. Yo creo que hay un tema allí que no es menor, que creo que es un tema significativo, y es que el gran globalizador, porque hay globalizers, como se dice en inglés, ¿no? Hay agentes que impulsaron la globalización. Algunos estados fueron globalizadores, las empresas transnacionales fueron globalizadoras, y el gran estado globalizador fue Estados Unidos. Todo el discurso y la práctica en favor de la globalización se dio en Estados Unidos. Estados Unidos ya no es globalizador. Por lo menos en la era Trump ya no tiene un discurso, ya es escéptico con la globalización. Entonces, creo que no es apoyo. Segundo punto, como 2 minutos para ir cerrando. El segundo punto, y creo que los primeros puntos son los centrales, es la competencia geopolítica. Hay competencia geopolítica por tecnología. Recordemos las amenazas o las acciones diplomáticas concretas de la primera administración Trump para que no se comprara el 5G de Huawei de China, por ejemplo. Claramente competencia cuando China deja de ser lo que era hace 30, 40 años, el productor de bienes baratos, de cosas de $1, y se comienza a producir bienes de alto contenido tecnológico, es una competencia que se está dando ahora entre la China. Hay competencia sobre recursos naturales. Y ya la competencia no tiene como sustento el petróleo, aunque esta vez la última de del petróleo sigue siendo muy importante, y los famosos minerales raros, tipo tierras raras, en los cuales América Latina tiene Cuba. Y hay lógicas de acción. China, jugando el comercio, incluso jugando a ser agente de energía, de productor de energía limpia, mientras que Estados Unidos diciendo, "Build, baby, build". Entonces hay lógicas entre las grandes potencias y creo que es fundamental el tema, digamos, chino-estadounidense, las distintas miradas que tienen no solo sobre el tema ambiental, sino también sobre la política global para determinar a dónde va. En el minuto que me queda, dos reflexiones finales. El tema del libre comercio. En los 90 era un pecado decir que el libre comercio era un error. Era un pecado decir que había que aplicar políticas proteccionistas. Cuando algunos autores americanos empezaron a hablar de políticas comerciales estratégicas, la periferia de los pensamientos está bastante legitimado el uso de la protección como instrumento político. Y eso es básicamente la política de Trump. La política de Donald Trump insisto, esta potencia militar. Las consecuencias que eso va a tener en la economía estadounidense o en la economía mundial están por medirse. La experiencia previa en la historia demuestra que una política proteccionista parcial para defender sectores estratégicos puede ser positiva para muchos países en sus áreas específicas. Porque una política regional y general global generalmente lleva a los países que la aplican en un proceso sucesivo y de estancamiento. No voy a repetir la historia, no lo sé. Pero, digamos, hoy en día el tema de la analiza es central en la política. Y para cerrar, porque ya creo que estoy incluso fuera del tiempo, el tema del surgimiento de las extremas derechas, algunas se llaman libertarias, que no tienen una agenda propiamente abierta, sino que al contrario consideran que este tema del calentamiento global es un periodo de evolución del planeta ha sucedido y estamos simplemente viviendo un periodo más, entonces que hay es poco parte de eso que relativamente suelen llamar de ideología. Yo creo que es un tema demasiado serio, simplemente tratando de hacer preguntas, ¿no? Pero esas fuerzas tienen poder, y no solo tienen poder en periféricos, latinoamericanos, asiáticos, africanos, sino en el centro del mundial ahora, que es Estados Unidos. Yo creo que esos 4 factores, ese es el contexto que tiene el pacto verde, y en ese contexto es en el cual o va a aplicarse, o va a lograr los objetivos, o va a tener, al contrario, obstáculos y dificultades. Gracias.
Bom dia. Vou falar inglês para tentar. E aí, se the best to involve the audience, but if I get some difficulty, I turn back to you. So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation, especially for the International Relations Department, Andrea and the Kate Monique. As the professor already talked about the current situation, and I will focus more about the challenges and I don't see too many opportunities right now, but at least some thoughts about how we can keep going in an optimistic and optimistic way to think about how the multilateral cooperation, especially the environment and climate change, can keep going this stock keyword. So, relates to challenge, Professor Viola already bring up a lot of these challenges that we're facing right now, especially the climate agenda. And we have more than 30 years of the international regime of climate change. We already have different moments, euphoric moments, since there's agreement, signature, some moments that we talk about transition, like during the Kyoto Protocol, and moments that we establish a kind of hope that this multilateral system can bring different perspective in a new world, like during after the Cold War, in the beginning of the UN decade of regimes that was created related to social, environmental, and other ones. So right now we have a very different perspective in this context, or that we don't see like that before, because in the past, when you had scenarios like war, the international system, when I talk about the past, before the first World War, we don't have a really international system that is have this format that we have like right now. So looking about the risks of the multilateralism, I think right now we are really facing the biggest moment since the creation of UN. They were really facing these extreme structures that was created related to the UN system, but of course there is a lot of connections between other regimes, you know. So when you look about the UNFCCC, that also have connections with the other causes that you see, you know, the biodiversity regime or the desertification regime that was created together. We see a different kind of methodology in this kind of negotiations. And of course, between these three, we have more focus on the climate change agenda, because the climate change agenda brings for the international system a big initiatives related to what the capitalism bring as the main importance or the main what this environmental system can bring to support the economy system. Also, when you talk about climate change in the regime, we're talking about reduce since the beginning, since the convention, we're talking about reduction emissions to keep the equilibrium of the media of the temperature, not the risk of decreasing of this medium. But in the beginning, you don't talk too much about adaptation, you don't talk about inequality, you don't talk about food security, you don't talk about the impacts. You talk more about the necessity of this equilibrium. So after 30 years, you already have these other topics that rise in the negotiations. But these topics, it's still in the base of how can you create opportunities for adaptation, how can you create opportunities for talk about food security and others, but related to how can you create new kinds of economic process inside of this. I follow up this negotiations in 2008. So this was before the Copenhagen Agreement, that was the biggest try to have a common agreement, no, for this multilateralism before, after the protocol, that they didn't really get to have the international agreement, so they keep going to Paris. And during this moment, we noticed that for the multilateral system to try to just keep going as a process, as a methodology, organizational methodology inside the international system, at least in the environmental agenda, it's important to have flexibility. But I think this flexibility that was bring, and I think Paris Agreement worldwide inaugurate this kind of flexibility. They bring an opportunity to keep alive this multilateral system, but at the same time, they bring a lot of challenges. Because when you bring it to a negotiation for a convention process that have lots of limits to be a binding agreement inside the international law, you create possibilities to engagement. So the states, they can engage with more interest because they will not lose too much. No, and they have the importance to be inside of this process, but at the same time, they is flexible enough to really don't have a turning point of change. So right now we are discussing a lot about transition, no, just transition, just approve a new mechanism of that in copying the length of 30. But if you see all the spectrum of this regime, since the beginning, they talk about position. When we recognize that there is a principle related to the common, but there is different responsibilities, we are saying that there is some countries that are more responsible for the other, even if you have responsibility for everybody. But when you create measures like Kyoto Protocol, that brings some topics that was targets for some of them and no targets for other ones, already created this idea of transition. But what you can see right now is that just transition, it's not enough related to this moment that you can see in this multilateralism. And this creates for us a very big paradox, because if you didn't approve the Paris Agreement at the moment, you create a lot of no legitimacy for the system, no, at least for the climate system. So Paris Agreement is very, very important to do a step, in a big step. But at the same time, as it's very flexible, as all the NDCs, the national determining contributions, it's voluntary. Even if they deliver that, there is no kind of obligation related to, if you see like the paragraph in the chapter of compliance related to this, if you see how can deliver all the in a different way, no, if each country deliver in the way they think their NDCs. Right now we have more transparency, you have more methodology, but even that is very far that what you can connect or comparison, like the inventories of emissions that countries already have, and this brings to us some kind of problems related, including to this transition. What I mean is, for this environmental and climate change regime that we're seeing right now in this multilateral cooperation system that's already had this big problem of cooperation, and for one hand, the opportunities, the last opportunities that we saw to save this multilateralism is in creating kind of flexibility process inside of these regimes to save this multilateralism. But this flexibility is at the same time, in a time of geopolitical big crisis related to the war we're seeing in Iran and US, and other kind of Russia, Ukraine, and like what's happening in Venezuela, all the treatments that have Cuba right now and other places, this flexibility is bringing to a no priority because it doesn't have priority of business. And you are seeing that no priority in the outcomes of this regime is bringing to us. I'm not entering the debate of the financing and all this because I prefer to discuss that in the next topic related to European Union and Latin American relationship. But I think this is a very important topic that I don't see before in the debates that we need to look. How can you save the system? And if there is any opportunity to save the system now, the idea of flexibility is not working. Working maybe 10 years ago, and when you approve the Paris Agreement. But for right now, with this other kind of challenge, and especially with Trump, that's accelerating all this process that the professor mentioned before, we really need to have a big debate in a lot of not only states, not only states exactly, we need to bring a very strong debate, reflection of what we think this is, how can we create really opportunities for the multilateral system. But right now, this both things, I think we are very compromised.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning. First of all, dear colleagues, dear students, I'd like to pay tribute to the organizer, Andrea, and her team for a fantastic, well-organized conference. And I'd like to share a little bit my perspective coming from Europe, will be the European perspective, with some focus also on the European Green Deal. But let's start maybe by stating the obvious, that is multilateral cooperation today is facing a moment of profound transformation, as Professor Viola has said. Something pretty fundamental is happening, and it reminds me a little bit of what Stefan Zweig wrote in his book, The World of Yesterday, that the old world is dying before our eyes, but the new one is still to be born. And we don't know what shape it will take. We know something pretty seismic is happening, but we are not yet sure what will come forward. And I really sincerely hope that in EU-LAC relations, we can contribute positively to the creation of a new world order. Now, from the perspective of the European Union, multilateralism remains essential. And let me give you a quote from last week, 19th of March. We had a European Council meeting in Brussels. And there again, the European Council committed itself to multilateralism and international law, but they admitted that these are being challenged. But they continued their somewhat strong and long-standing commitment to upholding the United Nations Charter, the rules and principles that it enshrines. In particular, as I said, those relating to sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and self-determination, reaffirming the European Union's commitment to effective multilateralism, to the rules-based international order, with the United Nations at its core, as well as its support to international institutions upholding international law. And there, interestingly, the European Council literally referred to the need to effectively protect international courts and their officials from any threats or sanctions, which I'm pretty sure you all know what is being referred to, the ICC and so on and so forth. So the EU itself is determined to remain a reliable, predictable, credible partner, and continues to work together with partners to maintain international peace and security, promote multilateral solutions to common challenges, as our treaty is saying, and that includes, of course, climate and environmental matters. And at the center of those climate and environmental matters, you have obviously the European Green Deal, which Andrea asked me to say a few words about, maybe just for our common recollection. It is a big initiative that started in 2019, the most ambitious strategy for sustainable development developed by the European Union, with as central objective to transform Europe into the world's first climate neutral continent by 2050. And that, of course, is a very bold objective, which requires a fundamental transformation of the economic model of the European Union. So that's why the Green Deal consists of an enormous range of policy initiatives in sectors such as energy, industry, transport, agriculture, and biodiversity. One of the key legislative packages under the Green Deal is what is called the Fit for 55 package, which aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. You may definitely have heard about some of the important instruments of which Fit for 55 consists: reform of the EU emissions trading system, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, pretty, I think, controversial in this part of the world, stronger renewable energy targets, energy efficiency measures, new standards for clean transport, and so on. There's a lot of debate currently going on in Europe about the reform of the EU emissions trading system. It's the world's largest carbon market, places a price on carbon emissions in sectors such as energy production, heavy industry, encouraging companies to invest in cleaner technology. It is pretty much also under attack within the European right now. And then there is CBAM. And CBAM is really the EU trying to link in climate policy to international trade, aiming to prevent what is called carbon leakage by ensuring that imported goods are subject to similar carbon costs as EU produced goods. But we know not everybody is a great fan of CBAM. But all of this EU Green Deal program essentially can also be linked to the goal to achieve the sustainable development goals, especially goals 7, affordable and clean energy, SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, and SDG 13, climate action. So yes, all of that is happening, but the global context is, of course, very, very challenging. And let me just, instead of again focusing on the challenge, let me try to see some positive opportunities. It may sound a little bit naive, but why not? Why not? 4 points that I would like to mention in terms of opportunities. I think, first of all, we do have a widespread recognition of the urgency of climate action. Maybe some incumbents of the White House who don't agree on this. But apart from that, extreme weather events, the economic and social consequences have made climate change a priority for governments around the world. Second, technological innovation. It offers new pathways for cooperation. There are advances in renewable energies, in digital technologies, sustainable production systems, and all of that can help to support economic development and environmental protection. Third, we live in a world that sees a lot of experimentation with new forms of global governance. Let's face it, the old systems may be under challenge, but there are new forms of cooperation. Think of climate alliances, green finance initiatives, partnerships between public and private actors. And the fourth opportunity I would like to mention is indeed about the private sector, which is increasingly engaged. Businesses and financial institutions are aligning themselves with sustainability goals, which creates, I think, an additional momentum for international cooperation. This being said, challenges remain. We do have both within the European Union and at the global level, I think, important challenges. I would like to simply say in the 1.5 minutes that I'm still allowed to speak, then I think there is an opportunity also for the EU and Latin America and Caribbean countries to work together in spite of all the reservations, in spite of all the worries that the Latin countries have with some of the EU initiatives. I think, after all, we do have many areas of shared interest, including renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, biodiversity protection, climate finance. And if we find a good mix of policy tools to address these through trade agreements, and again, EU-Mercosur is a major new development, through all forms of international cooperation funding, investment initiatives, I think that then we could really work together between the EU and Latin America and Caribbean countries. But it requires building trust. And that is so difficult in international law. We have a saying in Flanders, which is that, you know, trust takes ages to essentially to build, and it can be gone in just a couple of seconds. And so that's indeed true. We need to build trust. We need to ensure equity. We need to align our environmental objectives with economic and social development. But I fundamentally believe that the partnership between EU and LAC offers a valuable opportunity to move in that direction and to contribute to a more sustainable and cooperative global future. Thank you.
So we're going to second round. It is actually related to what you were saying. Thank you for the light. Yeah, but the idea would be now for each of you to address the possibilities and difficulties regarding specifically the relationship between Latin America and Europe in this sphere. So,
Bueno, a ver, yo creo que hay tres aspectos que se tienen que considerar. Obviamente, existe un enorme potencial. Ese siempre es el discurso de la relación biregional. La relación biregional siempre es una relación con enorme potencial. El enorme potencial en muchas áreas se ha quedado en un potencial y no se ha cumplido. Yo creo que eso vale tanto para la cooperación en el ámbito ambiental, en el climático como en otras áreas. Creo que eso obedece a situaciones en ambos lados del Atlántico, tanto del lado europeo como del lado americano. Eso por el lado americano. Porque, en primer lugar, ¿cuál sería el potencial? ¿Cuál sería el instrumento? ¿Cuál sería el mecanismo a través del cual América Latina y Europa pudieran, digamos, impulsar una agenda común en materia ambiental y en materia económica? El único espacio que conocemos hasta ahora es la cumbre de las. Existe institucionalmente hasta ahora la cumbre de la Unión Europea. Y la cumbre de las últimas dos cumbres de la Unión Europea no hablan de la buena salud, por lo menos de ese ámbito institucional. La cumbre que se hizo en Bruselas dejó muchas dudas, y de la cumbre que se hizo en Cartagena, ya la memoria de falla. O el año pasado, ya el bueno, hay cosas como que el canciller Merckx andaba por Sudamérica y no fue a Cartagena. O como que Macron estaba por México, y es el tipo oficial, y no fue a Cartagena. Entonces, creo que no son simplemente símbolos, son señales de el mecanismo institucional que se creó no está funcionando. Y entonces, yo, para no parecer siempre tan pesimista, ya que tengo un poco el optimismo que se le acá en la mesa, creo que tenemos tanto europeos que latinoamericanos tener imaginación, replantearnos nuevos mecanismos, porque esos mecanismos ya no están funcionando. Y eso es un hecho, creo que es real, ¿no? Hay una cumbre con China también, de la CELAC con China, que pareciera tener un mayor dinamismo. Es cierto que la cumbre con China no se hace a nivel presidencial, a diferencia de la cumbre con la CELAC, pero hay muchísima mayor participación, por lo menos en la última cumbre. Es un segundo elemento que tenemos que mirar del lado del continente americano. Hay competencia en muchas áreas, y el área ambiental es una de ellas, entre Europa, China y Estados Unidos, con visiones distintas sobre la temática. Obviamente, Estados Unidos, desde la llegada de Trump afuera, no es su preocupación promover una agenda hemisférica, como dicen en Estados Unidos, o sea, continental, sobre estos temas. La reunión que tuvo con 12 presidentes latinoamericanos hace 3 semanas, más o menos, fue sobre temas de seguridad. La visión de Estados Unidos de seguridad, los problemas de migración, narcotráfico, etc. En cambio, con el tema con China es complicado, porque China sí está apostando, y yo creo que lo está haciendo más bajo una lógica de negocios, que cualquier otra cosa, esa es mi percepción, al menos puede estar equivocado, a la producción de electricidad. Y está en las últimas declaraciones de las cumbres bilaterales, la China se incluyó el tema de la energía limpia e incluso se planteó recursos para apoyar iniciativas en el mercado. Que se van a cumplir o no se van a cumplir, es un tema que está por ver. En cambio, pues en Europa está el gran discurso y, bueno, yo creo que hay cooperación también, pero la narrativa no es exactamente lo que es. Entonces quería conectarlo con uno de los aspectos que, digamos, más lesiona o puede lesionar o puede afectar el medio ambiente, que es el tema de la infraestructura. Muchos países latinoamericanos son parte del Belt and Road y se sienten profundamente cómodos en el Belt and Road de Estados Unidos, cuya dimensión ambiental no es justamente su lado más fuerte. En Europa plantea como contraparte el global gateway. Pero entonces hay como muchos cuestionamientos sobre el global gateway, porque es demasiado global, demasiado general, Hay un tema de estrategias entre los tres polos, o entre los dos, porque ya vemos que por lo menos en la agenda actual de Estados Unidos de Trump, eso no forma parte. Y para no contar sobre los externos, porque yo nunca he sido seguidor de la teoría de la tendencia, tenemos un problema nuestro latinoamericano. Nuestros espacios regionales pues, pudieran ser mecanismos de los cuales nos consolidamos internamente, formamos posiciones comunes y luego vamos a negociar con los sectores externos, no están funcionando. No están funcionando en casi nada, pero sobre todo en su dimensión ambiental. Mercosur tiene una dimensión ambiental, un acuerdo ambiental que se firmó en el 2001, el Pacto Andino tiene negociaciones en políticas ambientales del año 96. La Centroamérica es un subsistema dentro del CICA que dedicaba al tema de medio ambiente, al tema de la sustentabilidad, y uno de esos esquemas está operando. Entonces, el sistema marco general latinoamericano, que es la CELAC, que es nuestro diálogo formal, no opera, no funciona. Y los marcos subregionales, en este momento al menos, están pasando por severas dificultades. Entonces, yo, sin pretender ser un pesimista por naturaleza, pero con todo lo ideal que es la relación biregional y que ciertamente es un espacio para promover, porque además, esto es importante decirlo, América Latina como Europa es un creyente, pero que la narrativa es el multilateralismo. Eso siempre ha sido parte de la narrativa latinoamericana, la defensa del multilateralismo. Estaría muy bien como un camino hacia el multilateralismo, consolidar esa relación regional y yo creo como producto que las cosas van en el derecho. Esa es la misma.
Let me say one thing before I move towards your comments. I wonder, particularly if Jan could address the following. We've been talking about how different logics and grammars are being subjugated to the logic and the grammar of geopolitics. And in the case of Latin America, and this is particularly clear in the 2025 strategic document produced by the American government, Latin America is described as a sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine is explicitly referred to. And I would like to ask, in this context, how does this affect the possibilities of cooperation in the field of in the field of climate change and the environment more generally between Latin America and Europe? You?
In the end, we're not sorry. No, but I didn't would like to feel. I'm very optimistic because I think the last days, especially for women, the last weeks and months is very bad, and all this war, it's bringing us because it's not the war only, no, it's the attitude of the states related to this war. So how come? But coming back to the Latin American and European relationship, was already the Green New Deal and how can this can be connected with cooperation policies, and if I would like to bring some examples of this kind of asymmetries that was mentioned already for the colleague. And how can we see not only this moment, but because historically European Union and Latin America has a lot of important moments of cooperation and bring a lot of common perspectives related to this building international regime. You know? So the multilateralism defense is a very strong flag, you know, not some countries right now in Latin America, not only unfortunately it's not all the countries, but for Brazil, it's very, very key, very, very important for the foreign politics in Brazil. But when you look, connect to both regions, you see how it's difficult to Latin America build kind of processes more strong related to be more powerful to dialogue in this cooperation, international cooperation in more strong basis. I think some of the issues is already pointed out by the colleagues, that you see the difficulty for Latin America to build, to institutionalize organisms that can create a better environmental to work together. Also, historically, we had some moments in the region, for example, when, maybe not when Mercosur was created, but like after around 10 years after the creation of Mercosur, you have interesting moments, no? Because you have some governments in Latin America that believe that regional integration is already an opportunity to get Latin America strong. So you have other initiatives that not only as Mercosur, like UNASUR, also CELAC brings some more opportunities at this point, and create inside of these institutions possibilities that you can have this better organic base. For example, in Mercosur, we create a kind of mechanism that's called post-sending. That's a mechanism that can face the inequalities between the countries of Mercosur. So during a moment, it was more focused related to Bolivia, to Paraguay. So how can you bring these countries a better opportunity for economy and social development? So with that, you can negotiate more the trade, and this regional space. Also, some moments, like when you talk about some moments like the first decade of 2000, okay? You have also working groups, some kind of working groups like the specialty working group on agriculture or gender. And this was a very, very special meetings, because you take the better public policy that's happening inside of these Mercosur countries and bring this to not only to exchange, but it was create some new realities. For example, when Brazil in 2004 created the law that differentiates the agribusiness, the main agriculture, to the familiar farmers' agriculture, this law was very, very important, because it can enable the country to create different policies related to the small farmers. So this law that created this definition, they also was implemented in Argentina, because Argentina think this is a very interesting law. This was not be able to do in Paraguay, but we're in this process. So I think this kind of moments of exchange was very important, because we can also, by the sense of cooperation, think about how regionally you can get together in this opportunity of reform, of institutionalization, things like that. Also, when the Parliament of Mercosur was created, we have not many people, there is some organizations that have also optimism about the possibility to have regional laws that was created to protect, especially the environment that was combined in the region. And this can also be opportunity for UNASUR, when you talk about Latin America and or South America, like Amazon, you have a big area of biodiversity, of forests, of traditional people that's on border, that it was shared by a lot of countries. So these ideas to protect collectively some areas was also very important to think about regionally. But we lost a lot of these policies and process. Why? Because in Latin America, we have a huge political heterogeneity that can, despite to have the politics is very related to policy of the government that have at this moment in the power. We do not think about how can the states have policies that can create a reach. How can you think about the role of these states in the future? And this also brings a big difference between European states. And there is some kind of policy that for the European Union it's very not only useful, but makes sense in the way they already have this to achieve this kind of development, but you don't have the same possibility in Latin America. And the keep trying of copying this kind of politics create a lot of big challenge for Latin American countries because it's not the same situation. And one of these not same situation, it's impossible to talk about environment or climate if you don't talk about inequality. Well, so I bring only two data that bring this huge differentiation between this block. For example, I talk about block when I talk about Latin America and Caribbean. When you think about the concentration of wealth in Brazil and in Latin America. In Brazil, 1% of more rich people, they keep 48% of the wealth. In Latin America, 1% is related, no, we don't have 1%, we have like 10% in Latin America, it's concentrate 43.5%. This is for 2023, and in Brazil, 2024. But Colombia, if you see Colombia, it's the same thing as Brazil. If you think about concentration of land, that's you can't talk about environment and climate if you don't talk about land. And this is one of the big mistakes you see widely when you see the debates. Why? Because everything is under the land and or the topic of the land. Because when you talk about emissions, you talk about CO2, for example, and you are talking about how can you deal with this land or fossil fuels or forests or to keep exploring mining. So everything have to bring to that. So the concentration of land in Latin America, 1%, concentrate 51% of the land. And Brazil, Paraguay, and Colombia is the three top countries for that. And this brings us a huge challenge related to this debate. So as I don't have the European Union agreement in Mercosur bring back all this discussion in the last 3 years because we have a completely asymmetrical agreement that don't take care of these disparities between the blocks, bring a lot of, in Brazil, we have including governments representatives that change their words after they come back to the power, that call, like 4 years ago, there's a lot, neo-colonial agreement, but when the Lula government joined the power, they changed this speech. But exactly because you are keep Latin America as a big farm, as a big strategic power with all the mining and how the resources that they can offer to the European Union and as and what Latin America receive in this change, they keep building and keep buying the products industrialized with high value to European. And all this topic is even with the amendments that Brazil made and Argentina during this moment, also European Union, they bring two kinds of not only these asymmetries is be worse, but you keep bringing also different perspectives between what is the people, what is the population that can be treated in Latin America and how the European Union people can keep it treated, because the agreement didn't bring this idea of equity. No, here we can keep eating agrotalks like we are eating in Brazil, because there is a lot of this kind of products that keep be exported by European Union, and a lot of them is banished inside of European Union. So they produce to sell for us. And this the agreement will keep going. So how can you really face the idea of cooperation? I really believe that it's important that if you still have the system, the cooperation should be the main baluarte, I don't know this word in English, but how can you really face this ideal of cooperation that can really face this kind of asymmetries, and you bring a word that you really can increase the possibilities to transformation together, not only defend your transformation to the inequality or some zones of successful, but the other ones that can keep receiving all these outcomes of this kind of model. So I think this is one more debate that we should bring on discussion.
Okay, thank you for the question, Monica. You are referring to this remarkable document from November last year, the new US security strategy. I'm not sure who has read it here. I recommend reading it just to wake up to the realities of this administration, because it is extremely negative about Europe. It essentially talks about Europe committing some kind of collective suicide, doing what is called civilizational erasure, literally, because of our bad migration policies and so on and so forth. I mean, I will not go further into some of the aspects of that, but I want to, let's say, I want to develop some thoughts about what I see as a possible slowly emerging collision between, on the one hand, US-LAC and EU-LAC relations, because something is going to explode. We now have only an emerging, let's say, relationship with the EU-Mercosur agreement. It will be provisionally applied from May onwards, and that's great. Those of you who don't know what provisional application is, I'm happy to give you a little course on international treaty law after this session. But I mean, yes, this will be applied. There will be all kinds of dynamics, and I think we really, as a network and as colleagues, Latin America and Europe, we owe it to ourselves and our students and our societies to really start developing lots of common research and events, studying and really trying to assess the implications of EU-Mercosur to get a better understanding of it. So that's really a research agenda for the years to come. But I think I see a slow coalition emerge. Well, as soon as the White House will see what positive dynamics will be generated by the EU-Mercosur agreement in our mutual relationship, they will try to block it. And that's exactly from your point of view, the sphere of influence, the Monroe Doctrine in whatever the variation, but also because they just dislike the fact that there is regional integration and that regional blocs will start working together much more closely. We came from a conference in Buenos Aires of last week, and I was told by my colleagues in Argentina that Argentina and the US have just concluded a bilateral agreement, which I don't know the exact details of, but which I assume is hardly compatible with the obligations of Argentina under the EU-Mercosur agreement. So what will happen there? You know, that's going to be fireworks, most probably, and it will have to do with access or priority access to critical minerals and so on and so forth. So maybe sooner rather than later, I think there's going to be again all kinds of complexities, and then it will be the question: how resilient will we be to uphold our bi-regional relationship? When Maureen was talking about regional integration in Latin America, I have to make a little confession to you. When I was in Buenos Aires last week, I decided to make a quick visit to Montevideo because I really wanted to get to know the Mercosur secretary. I really wanted to see it because really in Europe we have all kinds of visions and ideas about Mercosur. Okay, I went there. I had a great appointment with the Director General of Mercosur. I asked him how many people are working here, because of course I come from Europe, and you know in the European Commission you have 28,000 people working. So you may guess the answer. We could do a quiz here. Well, it's 47 people. 47 people all in total. And I mean, I have all kinds of questions because we, Europe, I'm not saying the European model is superior, but you know at least that we have laws that can be enforced by the European Commission, bringing cases before the European Court against member states. So I asked about enforcement mechanisms, and there was no reply. The Secretariat said we are just an administrative secretariat. We cannot enforce. In fact, we are not even involved in the negotiations. We don't know what's the content of the EU-Mercosur agreement because we have simply not been involved in the negotiations. So for me, all of this was pretty brutal in terms of awakening. But I would really like to ask our Latin American colleagues, first of all, bring Mercosur back into the limelight, because I have the impression the research agenda and publications on Mercosur have really declined. But also, I mean, you have to do something about capacity. I mean, it cannot be that you have just 4 or some more countries sending their delegates and then making agreements. But the Secretariat, I mean, you can even wonder, they said we are an intergovernmental organization. Well, I'm inclined to challenge them, because intergovernmentalism is more than this. And so I really think that you have to critically look at how can a regional organization really work? What are the minimum capacities that you have to put at a certain level of centrality? I'm not saying again that the European model should be followed, not at all. But you have to really think about how to make it an efficient system where there is transparency. I asked about, you know, what we in Europe call the acquis, which is we have this whole overview of thousands and thousands of existing EULAS, which are all online and you can pretty much consult everywhere. It's not the case in Mercosur. For the recent laws, they say they have digitalized them. But apparently there is an enormous amount of previous laws that are just somewhere, I think, in one of the basements of the Mercosur Secretariat. I don't know, but I mean, you need to, you need to really digitalize and know what is the acquis, what are the norms that are existing, how are they being properly followed up, how can you make sure that each of the Mercosur members does indeed what they have committed themselves to do. I mean, these are very serious questions, and I think also we may go for big disappointments under the EU-Mercosur agreement when in the end it will not work. When there will not be sufficient capacity to follow up and to implement the agreement in a more or less uniform way between the current Mercosur countries. So I'm really pleading for a kind of revival of regional integration dynamics in Latin America, but it cannot come from Europe, definitely not. I'm always afraid of coming across as an arrogant European who say, "Oh, look at our institutions." No, you have to build your own ownership of institutions, but at least do make institutions. Because what I've seen in that former hotel at the coastline of Montevideo, that I don't think is the future of regional integration. So I'm going to stop here. I had prepared some other remarks because I have some thoughts myself about the insufficiencies of the Paris Agreement and some other things, but we can maybe leave that for a later discussion.
Thank you so much. I think if Andrea allows me, we can take 3 questions and then we'll close. So I have Eduardo, I have you. Okay.
Okay. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Yo tengo una pregunta para usted, que inclusive me permite complementar todo lo que muy la apertura. Y lo siguiente, yo creo que hay 3 países que tienen en América Latina políticas climáticas relevantes, consistentes, que grado diversos. Costa Rica, que fue el primero, pero no tiene mucha importancia en el mundo. Brasil, que fue el segundo, y tercero, Chile. Muy bien. Creo que la influencia de la Unión Europea en los 3 casos es muy, muy importante. ¿No? O sea, la Unión Europea ha promovido políticas climáticas en los 3 países. El caso de Costa Rica fue una influencia extrema, comenzando en el inicio de la década del 90. Entonces, mi pregunta es para José, ¿por qué bueno, mi avaliación puede ser que tú no concordas? México no ha tenido política climática, mínima consistencia, nunca tuvo un inicio con Calderón, pero no avanzó, y con AMLO es anticlimática la política, digamos, y Sheinbaum, que es una ex profesora de Environmental Studies en la University of California, no ha tenido tampoco. Entonces, ¿cómo ves eso? ¿Por qué en México, cuando tenía condiciones relativamente favorables desarrollar una política climática consistente con ingenuos no desarrollo.
I want to ask Jan about your idea of new forms of cooperation and even the weakening of the international order, the rules-based order. Do you think that this is possible to achieve effective international cooperation and international governance on sustainable development and climate change without enforceable international law?
There was one more.
So many.
EULAS, University of Warsaw, University of Assas. I have a question to Professor Walters. My question is, how do you assess the legal tensions between the unilateral and maybe, unfortunately, Eurocentric character of CBAM and deforestation regulation with the bilateral and cooperation-based character of the TSD chapters of trade agreements between EU and Latin American countries like with Mercosur or with Chile, for example, and Mexico. Thank you.
Gracias. Una pregunta muy corta. ¿Consideran ustedes que las políticas climáticas o de sostenibilidad del medio ambiente se están quedando sin electores? Porque yo veo mucho el argumento de que hay un problema, o esto sería algo agencial que vendría de los partidos de extrema derecha, pero resulta que lo que estamos viendo es que miran el cinturón del óxido que pasó a votar por Trump en Estados Unidos, explica el 2010 lo que pasó en 2016 y después el 2024, que son electores tradicionalmente demócratas, pero que, o de izquierda, pero que hoy día no votan por este tipo de políticas, y eso está pasando en otras latitudes. Entonces, ¿qué pasa con esa dimensión más estructural que está en la ciudadanía, más allá de los partidos políticos que tienen plataformas? Porque los partidos políticos pueden tener plataformas, pero si no tienen votos, no impactan en la viabilidad de este tipo de políticas. Muchas gracias.
A ver, perdón. La verdad es una excelente pregunta, ¿no?
Gracias.
A ver, cuando conozco, digamos, el proceso político mexicano contemporáneo reciente, que el gran giro se produce en el año 94, año 92, más hasta 86, que llaman la adopción del modelo neoliberal en México. El modelo neoliberal nunca ha estado en eso es muy cierto. Ahora, ¿cuál es la razón por la cual podemos entender que, digamos, en la lógica de la apertura de mercado que inspiró la reforma cultural de casi todos los países de América Latina en los años 90, y el tema ambiental, pero no hay, por ejemplo, en el consenso de Washington una mención del tema ambiental, que fue un caso, ¿no? Entonces, es como lógico que los gobiernos liberales, en el caso de Calderón, siempre Calderón en México es un caso bizarro, un caso extraño, o sea, cosas que fueron finalmente no cumplidas, y terminó haciendo básicamente lo inverso de lo que finalmente se proponía, ¿no? El tema de seguridad, la lucha contra el narcotráfico, es el excelente ejemplo de eso, ¿no? Pero ¿por qué la administración a partir de 2018, que se supone una administración de izquierda, que tiene en su alianza, en su plataforma política, es importante, al Partido Verde, que no es tan ecológico el Partido Verde en México, no es un partido más oportunista de alianza de cierta tal en el poder, pero que se define como Partido Verde. Y no ha logrado, no solo lo ha logrado, sino que ha desafío. Hay un proceso de carbonización en México, son plantas eléctricas o no se llama, de refinerías, compra incluso de refinerías en Estados Unidos, que va en contra de la lógica, digamos, global. Yo creo que también, pero aquí estoy haciendo una conjetura, por el día que va a ser la conjetura en público, las limitaciones que crea el mercado norteamericano con Estados Unidos, Telecom y a la hora también, no contribuyó a que se creara un suerte de actor externo, como de repente sí lo hace Europa, y por eso tiene influencia, como bien señalas, en la política ambiental de Brasil o de Costa Rica, pero en Estados Unidos el tema ambiental en las negociaciones del Telecom de los 24 fueron tan complejas que al final se decidió crear un acuerdo paralelo de temas ambientales vinculados con el comercio. Estrictamente acotado, que por lo demás, una convención ambiental de América del Norte que nunca funcionó, porque bueno, la institucionalidad, por Michael's Jan, institutionality is not only problem in Mercosur, in NAFTA there is no institutionality, and in the Pacific Alliance, the institutionality is flexible and light. So maybe Mercosur is much stronger than I think in Latin America. Pero bueno, esa es otra historia. Yeah, yeah. At least 37 people. Entonces creo que el contexto norteamericano no contribuyó tampoco a tener una suerte de incentivo externo para modificar una tradicional política que se mantiene y que ni siquiera el cambio ideológico que se produjo en México la modificó. Y la pregunta de si el cambio climático está perdiendo lectores es una pregunta muy interesante, creo, también para pensarla, porque hay otras cosas que las pienso sacar como se dice en caliente, porque es que el problema es, puede verse quizás en Europa, eso pasó con el tema de los agricultores. La primera reacción de los agricultores europeos al cambio climático, a la, perdón, ¿cómo se llama? El green policy, que le estaba pidiendo reestructurar su forma de producir. Estaba pidiendo dejar de utilizar ciertos fertilizantes, dejar de utilizar lo que encarecía la producción. Y además, en un contexto donde tienen que competir con productores del resto del mundo, agrícola. La reacción del sector agrícola fue no. ¿Qué hizo Europa? Creó balances, equilibrios. O sea, hay un apoyo a los agricultores europeos para que puedan transitar ese cambio que se plantea en la política verde europea. Eso, por ejemplo, no sucede en Estados Unidos. En Estados Unidos, esos agentes que sienten que pueden ser afectados por las políticas más estrictas en materia ambiental, no sienten que hay una protección del Estado que lo compense. Y por eso pierden o quitan apoyo a cualquier política ambiental que la ve como una amenaza. Pero bueno, eso se me está ocurriendo ahora con respuesta, porque la pregunta es muy interesante, porque es cierto, es un poco más allá de que simplemente hay ascensos de gobierno, de partidos políticos de extrema derecha. Esa es parte de la ecuación, pero creo que no explica toda la ecuación de por qué en términos electorales las políticas sobre cambio climático son un poco más impopulares hoy que hace una década más. Gracias.
Estoy pensando la última pregunta que tiene que ver con las políticas, ¿no? Y cómo yo quiero comprender un poco más de el conservadorismo en la política está cambiando un poco esta visión en relación al cambio climático. En Brasil, yo no puedo hablar de América Latina sobre eso porque no sé mucho cómo está, pero en Brasil hay se permanece está mejor, digamos que de la comprensión de los efectos, aún tenemos mucho más los eventos extremos y eso de alguna forma está cambiando más la relación con la población, ¿no? Cómo la población está mirando el cotidiano y eso obviamente acaba creando una demanda más precisa en relación a las políticas públicas o a demandas del Estado, que está haciendo, que está haciendo, o conectando un poco más eventos que son anuales, pero siempre, ¿no? Siempre pasan lluvias muy fuertes en Río de Janeiro. Son cosas que siempre pasan. Pero ahora está pasando aún más con más frecuencia, mucho más intensidad. Entonces, obviamente, el cambio climático está haciendo un efecto más grande en este proceso. Pero aún no tenemos una... Ah, perdón. Y el año pasado, con la COP30 en Brasil, este tema fue mucho más popularizado, porque se tiene la mídia brasileña, se ha comprado el tema, ha trabajado mucho. Yo trabajo más con los movimientos sociales y veo que, históricamente, desde el momento de justicia climática, nosotros estamos ahí 15, 18 años construyendo este movimiento. Y con los movimientos sociales de Brasil siempre era muy difícil hablar, porque pensaban que, bueno, la justicia climática es una cosa para los pueblos indígenas, es para los pueblos territoriales, no para los movimientos sociales del campo, ¿no? Pero hay un cambio también de motivación, de comprensión de la importancia de esas cosas. Entonces, no sabemos, este año es un año electoral, vemos que en Colombia está pasando esto con más fuerza también, y que puede ser que la demanda para los candidatos en esta discusión sea más clara, porque hasta 2 años atrás, en la elección, eran poquísimos candidatos que ponían el cambio climático na pauta más certera. Y obviamente tenemos más rechazo a esta discusión en el Parlamento brasileño, ¿no? Porque hay un Parlamento mucho más conservador, especialmente atrelado a un agronegocio que se dice sustentable afuera de Brasil, pero adentro tiene mucho más fuerza política para seguir rompiendo las leyes que hay, las leyes que aún tenemos de protección ambiental. Entonces, por un lado, hay un discurso, sí, de que es importante. Acabamos de aprobar ahora el Plan Clima, la versión, ¿no? Se aprobó esta semana, se fue la semana pasada. Se ve las políticas siempre, el principal vector de deforestación es el agronegocio y la pecuaria, la ganadería. Pero al mismo tiempo, cuando se ve las políticas que penalizan los sectores, la industria, la minería siempre recibe mucho más impacto. Y ahí no veo muy mal ese plan en ese sentido, pero el agronegocio siempre sale de alguna forma positivamente, solo ganando las oportunidades, ¿no? De las políticas. Entonces creo que es algo quizá un poco más de cómo las políticas públicas, la legislación puede realmente mirar estos sectores y mirar también estos cambios necesarios para que esas políticas climáticas puedan ir en una dirección más positiva. Pero no veo, aunque tenemos sí negacionismo y todo, pero no tuvieron tanta fuerza acá en Brasil, por lo menos en la pauta pública, ¿no? Con la opinión pública, no fue tanto como pasado en otros países, por ejemplo, ¿no? Italia, y tuvieron un poco más de todo. Y solo hablando sobre la institucionalización, y ahí te digo que si fuera el Parlamento de Mercosur, se quedaron preocupados con los debates que se pasan allí, ¿no? Pero tuve un momento, como dije, ¿no? En la primera década de los 2000, y eso tiene mucho que ver con los gobiernos que hacen la prioridad en la costa regional. En este momento, discutimos un banco, como Luna Sur, políticas de freno, ¿no? De combate a la inequalidad, porque si las asimetrías entre Europa y el Mercosur son muy fuertes, imagina entre los países de los países de América do Sur y de Latinoamérica y el Caribe son muchos profundos, ¿no? Entonces, eso es importante tener como un bloque, porque hay un resentimiento muy grande, por ejemplo, de Paraguay con Brasil, ¿no? De Bolivia con Chile. Entonces, cómo también se construye una integración en la cual estos elementos que no fue una cosa solo de guerra, y taipúes, así, ¿no? Siendo una cosa de resentimiento fuerte, de la salida del mar de Bolivia, pero hay algunas tentativas, creo que de cambiar un poco el debate, y eso termino aquí, que para nosotros que estamos pensando un poco la transformación, essas instituições, na forma que são criadas, não estão oferecendo oportunidades reais de uma transformação. Em geral, elas intentam, por mais que seja uma ideia da descarbonização ou do paquete verde, não há uma transição, não há cambio muito forte, porque, vou dar um exemplo, se discute o cambio climático, o principal motor é a redução de CO2, mas não importa. Y cuando hablamos de integridad ambiental, nos necesitamos hablar de la discusión mucho más amplia que tiene que ver con el medio ambiente o un ecosistema como un todo. Yo puedo reducir emisiones con eucalipto, yo puedo reducir emisiones plantando árboles para un bioma específico. Pero si miro solo para las emisiones, no voy a mirar para toda esta integralidad que es necesaria para un cambio. Y sobre eso no vemos espacio. No vemos espacio en la UNED, no vemos espacio en las políticas regionales y no hay espacio para este tipo de debate en el foro local. Y mucho menos para los entes de las regiones que son los que están proponiendo la diferencia. Los pueblos indígenas, hay una cosa de la cláusula tal, no hay una cláusula de protección, ¿no? Pero si nos salvaguardamos los que están realmente haciendo una diferencia para un mundo de futuro, va a ser muy difícil con essas instituições que tenemos apostar en cosas como, pongo una taja en la minería, para mí es muy importante, pero eso no va a cambiar el todo, porque esa taja sería solo importante para transitar para un nuevo nivel. No en el futuro. Y eso para mí creo que es lo más importante que deberíamos estar hablando de esto. Gracias.
Well, I got two questions. One on how can you achieve effective international cooperation without enforceability of international law? Yeah, big question. Depends on the fundamentals, of course, and I'm inclined to say that international law is enforced, but it depends on which ways and on which kind of actors. First of all, in the field of climate change and environmental law, we have seen the last couple of years some pretty amazing legal developments in the form of what I would call climate change litigation. Climate change litigation, I do not know what the dynamics are in Latin America. I'd be very interested to learn about it. But at least in Europe, we have seen really quite far-reaching judgments being reached in a number of countries, including Belgium and the Netherlands. We have seen the so-called Klima Seniorinnen case against Switzerland before the European Court of Human Rights. We have seen three major advisory opinions of the international courts, the ICJ, the Law of the Sea Tribunal, the Inter-American Court. And so I really think that, I mean, maybe a bit unexpectedly, but all of these cases, both the national ones, the ones at the regional level, like the European Court of Human Rights, like the Inter-American Court, and the ones on the global level, like EULAS and the ICJ, I think this all, in a way, adds to, I would say, enforceability, or at least putting additional pressure on national governments to be serious about reaching climate goals. And I think, I mean, it requires a bit of a deeper analysis, but there you see how a lot of enforcement can actually be, if you wish, triggered by very active and resilient civil society movements. So I'm a deep believer in the force of civil society actors when it is about to making sure that governments stick to their international commitments. So you need a vibrant civil society everywhere to be able to, make that an issue at the local level, but also take kind of coordinated international action. It's not a sufficient answer because I know there are so many shades of gray when it is about the enforceability systems at the global level, at the regional level. The domestic system, how is international law being incorporated, implemented in the national legal systems of Latin America? I would really love to make some kind of comparative research project about that with what we're doing in Europe. But so I think there are ways that we cannot just bluntly say, well, international law is simply not enforceable. That I really don't agree on. There was a second question, very interesting, about how to reconcile, if you wish, tensions between what I would essentially call the more unilateral approach of the EU by adopting rules that sometimes have far-reaching extraterritorial implications, such as CBAM, the deforestation regulation, and there are quite a number of other rules as of late, on the one hand, and what the EU is doing in its bilateral trade agreements through sustainability chapters and so on and so forth. In fact, I would like to put this on a kind of, gliding scale, because I've started my presentation initially about the EU's commitment to multilateralism. And you can really be very critical about all these things, because if you're really a multilateralist, why are you then going rather to bilateral deals in the trade field? And why in certain areas are you totally unilateral? And how is that consistent with your so-called multilateral commitment? And I think indeed it's a big field of tension, and we should critically engage with EU policymakers about that. There has been an enormous reaction against some of those unilateral measures of the EU. And I remember it was not the last, but the forelast State of the Union speech of Ursula von der Leyen in the European Parliament, that she actually said, before we start making new legislation, we should really consult our main trading partners, where she was actually hinting to Latin American countries and their criticism on things such as CBAM. I'm not sure whether they have improved their track record with regards to ex-ante coordination and consultation, but I think it's absolutely needed. No, I mean, you need to be consistent with yourself. If you're saying in your treaties you go for multilateral solutions for common problems, fine, then do it. And only when multilateralism is really not working and you have done your best to make it work. And by doing your best, I really believe the EU should do more. I firmly believe that the EU is not doing enough currently within the WTO. The EU is a leading member. It has an enormous capacity to come up with positive proposals if it wants to. But you know what has gone wrong in the WTO, and essentially since what happened in Cancun in 2003, the EU is like, has more or less taken a distance and said, we're going to prioritize our deep and comprehensive bilateral trade agreements, like many other countries have done. And so that, of course, has brought us to this whole, spaghetti bowl, as it has been said, of bilateral agreements and those trade and sustainability chapters, which I think are good as long as they build upon the WTO plus, compatible with the spirit and the principles of the WTO, but still, it requires constant looking back and forth to make sure if it is still constructive also from this multilateral point of view. And then especially with regard to the unilateral legislation, well, that's really almost a kind of, desperation cry of the EU when they say it's not working bilaterally, so we have to do it totally unilaterally. I think, okay, fine. Again, in the very last resort, if neither the multilateral nor the bilateral track really can work, but you have to do your very, very best to make those other tracks work before you go towards this extraterritorial unilateral regulation, because in my view, it's very destructive for the real bonding and partnerships that we are making with important regions such as Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for taking part, and I don't want you to remain hungry, so.
So there are a lot of kiosks around the campus for people to eat, and we have only half an hour, maybe the first